Hello.
Hello.
Hello, everybody.
Hello, friendly.
Hello.
Always one of the most fun parts of all of our events is everybody filing in. The authors are all here. They're in the house. We'll be chatting, having a good time. So I think it's probably time to go ahead and get started. Sound right, Kate?
Yep.
Let me mute everybody
Yeah, I can do that.
and make sure that we're recording. So welcome everybody to our first Meet the Authors event. We're super excited about this. I'm Kari, the director of Midwest Booksellers, and I am the author getter for Heartland. I'm here with Larry Law, the director of Great Lakes, and Kate Scott, the project specialist at Midwest Booksellers. Remember the good old days when we all hung out in real life with authors and got a copy of their galleys to sign? Well, we think that this new format doesn't lack for any of the excitement of discovering new books to read and sell. This fresh crop of books is poised to find a good home in indie bookstores this year. Each of our 10 authors has 5 minutes to present their forthcoming book, and will share the galley request link as they present. Please ask questions or share comments in the chat field at any time. That's one of the most fun aspects of these events. And we'll also pause between presenters to take comments or questions. With that, I will move on to our first author. And authors, I will let you know when when you have 1 minute left in your presentation. So Kate will focus on the speakers as they present. Our first author, we're going in alphabetical order, is Billy Ray Belcourt, a writer and academic from the Drift Pile Cree Nation. He has received multiple awards for his writing and his community leadership. He's here today to talk about A History of My Brief Body, which will be released in August via Penguin Canada, and in just a few days by our friends at $2 Radio in Ohio. A History of My Brief Body is for readers of Ocean Vuong and Maggie Nelson. It's a brave, raw, and fiercely intelligent collection of essays on grief, colonial violence, joy, love, and queerness. Please take it from here, Billy Ray.
Thank you. Hi, I am Canadian icon and noted homosexual poet Billy Ray Belcourt. I'm, excuse the setting, I'm on a camping trip with my partner, and perhaps it's part of the magic of Zoom is that makes this possible. So as was mentioned, my forthcoming collection, A History of My Brief Body, beautifully designed and put together by the wonderful folks at $2 Radio, is in part memoiristic, but it is also essayistic and poetic. And so that comes out of my, first 2 books were of poetry, and, reading the authors that I read, including, the 2 mentioned already and others for whom genre is not, in a position, but a challenge, in that the boundaries are always porous and intermingling. So the book begins with a letter to my kukum, my grandmother, and then ends in the present, both with 2 egregious acts of violence in Canada and in the US. So in Canada, the killing and subsequent trial of an Indigenous man in the prairies, and then the Pulse nightclub shooting in Orlando. And so what I'm trying to do in that sort of chronology is show how my lived life becomes an occasion to think about the ways that structures of violence and indifference inhibit livability and flourishing, and how I do that is not stick to a linear mode, but I actually disobey linearity and chronology in the service of something like collage or juxtaposition that allows for modes of thought that aren't normally put together, say the theoretical and the personal, to be put together and to see what emerges from that synthesis. The book also tries to offer up a theory of Indigenous freedom in particular, but freedom also as it has to do with queer and trans folks, and other people of color. And, I think what it, amounts to in the end is a kind of call to arms that, there's so much that we can do in the world of literature, not just to reshape ideas about livable presents and livable futures, but also, to reconfigure the modes of perception and embodiment and feeling in the present so that, we can rupture and breach all of the ways that we have been made to make do in a present that is, inhospitable to so many of us. And I think I will stop there.
Well, thank you, Billy Ray. There's so much great praise for this book. I cannot wait to see it come out on the shelves and read it. Also, as I said, galley request links are coming through on the chat, so feel free to go ahead and request your galleys. So thank you. We will move on to Joanna Davidson Politano, the award-winning author of 2 previous novels, love stories that capture the colorful, exquisite details of ordinary lives. Joanna will be talking about her new novel, The Love Note, released by Baker Publishing Group under the Revel imprint this October. Laced with mysteries large and small, this romantic Victorian-era tale of love lost and found is sure to delight. Joanna lives with her husband and their 2 kids in a house in the woods near Lake Michigan. So take it away, Joanna.
Thank you. So I'm Joanna, and my latest book is called The Love Note. It's a lost love letter story, and it deals with really deep disappointment in love, as well as the power of words. And this really came about from a lot of my friends who approached me with just these really, really deep-seated disappointments with their love life, whether they were married or not. And so I started kind of untangling the need that we all feel to be known and to be loved, and exactly what can meet that need. So the heroine is fascinated by love stories as long as they're not her own. She's decided to remain single and pursue a career in medicine, which was a little bit anti-cultural for that time period, of course. So she's having a lot of trouble getting into medical school and finding clients and things like that. And she really doesn't think that marriage is compatible with that, but she secretly does kind of hope that someday she'll fall in love and find something authentic. So she finds this love letter in an old desk in her house, and she decides to try to patch up this couple. And it's an unopened love letter, so somebody didn't get it. And she wants to go back and figure out who wrote it. She's very captivated because it's a very passionate letter, and it's a secret love. So whoever they wrote it to never found out that they loved this person. So she goes back to the house it came from, and she decides to try to patch them back together, as long as it's not too late, because she doesn't even know how old this letter is. So she ends up misplacing the letter, and it gets found by somebody else who then believes they have a secret admirer. And the letter and the very powerful words in it kind of float around the house and have a really huge impact on a lot of different people. And the different characters figure out many different forms of love and of meeting that desire to be known and to be loved by someone. And it brings up a lot of kind of secret desires that people had and hidden feelings and things like that. And when she first gets there, the whole house is very, very cold. So she can't even imagine who would have written such a passionate letter. She looks at the servants. She looks at the people who live in the house. There's a lot of family, and basically everybody kind of dislikes everybody else. So she can't figure out who wrote the letter and who they wrote it to. And it keeps twisting and turning. And then she has a family friend who lives in the house who was her childhood sweetheart many, many years ago. And so there's a little bit of thread of romance in it. And she ends up finding the person who wrote the letter. And it's a very surprising person, and who they wrote it to is also surprising. So readers who enjoy Regency authors like Sarah Ladd would probably enjoy this book. Chilling suspense from Jamie Jo Wright, a more gothic style unfolding mysteries like Kate Morton, or quirky fresh mysteries like Anna Lee Huber might enjoy this story. I also draw lots of inspiration from the Brontes and Daphne du Maurier as far as style goes, and a little bit of Dickens for a classic novel feel. I have 3 other novels, and here's 2 of them to give you an idea of the flavor of them. And they're all standalones. People have called them a Gothic style, surprising and deeply layered. So there's a mixture of a lot of really tender moments, a lot of depth, a lot of deep thinking, and just, you know, a lot of poignant moments and things like that. So The Love Note is a complex story about authentic love in many forms. It's about releasing lost love and young love and things like that. So I'm really excited to share it with readers. And I mean, I kind of hope they're as surprised as I was with the whole thing. So thank you.
Thank you, Joanna. You were kind of soupy there for a little bit with the connection. I'm not sure whose connection is slow. So somebody
It might be mine.
Okay, flag me down if you can't hear me or if I slow down. If there's any questions for either of the authors, feel free to jump in between authors. We will move on to Lin Enger. Welcome now to Lin Enger, here to introduce his October release from the University of Minnesota Press, American Gospel. Lin Enger has published 2 previous novels, including The High Divide, a finalist for our Midwest Booksellers Choice Award. A graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop, he teaches English at Minnesota State University in Moorhead. Author Nick Butler calls American Gospel a tenderly written, expertly plotted book that culminates in an ending for the ages, which of course we'll all get to read when we request a galley. So please explain your new book to us, Lin Enger.
Yeah, thanks for this invitation. Thanks to all of you booksellers who I value so much, especially these days. And thanks to my editor at the U of M Press, Eric Anderson. It's been a pleasure to work with him. American Gospel is set to be published this fall in October. The book is set in 1974, but it's very much about the present time. It's about the obsession this country has with the idea of a hard stop to life as we know it, apocalypse, which has been a lot in the news lately. It's a book about how people of good intentions can be manipulated by lies. 1974, as you might remember, is the year Richard Nixon's lies caught up to him. It's also a book about how dogma, religious and political, undermines the real power of belief. The premise is simple. An old man who is a farmer turned prophet and leads a commune on a lake in northern Minnesota has a vision in early August 1974. His vision is that Christ is going to return to earth in 14 days. My novel is the fast-moving narrative that documents, dramatizes those 14 days, rotating among 3 characters: the old man himself, his son, who's a New York writer, and a Oscar-winning Hollywood actress who has connections to both the father and the son. I came of age in the 1970s when nuclear annihilation was a tangible reality and when distrust in the political system was at an all-time high. Books about the apocalypse and dystopias abounded then, much as they have in the last 15 years with the popularity of pandemic, zombie, and post-nuclear war stories. In my English class, my senior year in high school, in one semester I read On the Beach, 1984, and Alas, Babylon. But the best-selling nonfiction title of that whole decade, according to the New York Times, was The Late Great Planet Earth, which was meant to persuade readers that Christ's rapture of believers into heaven was imminent. It was a subject I knew something about. I grew up in an evangelical family, and I had the rapture coming at me from all directions. Time and again, I was told by people who I trusted that it was going to happen soon in my lifetime. I wasn't sure if I believed them, but I was absolutely sure that I didn't want to. I wanted to live my life as long as possible without any divine or cosmic interruptions. In any case, whether I liked it or not, the laundry list of failed prophets continued and continues. Google it sometime. Year after year, prophet after would-be prophet. The predictions keep coming, many of them predicting down to the day. I wrote my novel in an attempt to purge my frustration and answer some questions. What are the connections between religious dogma and a country's political health? A 2010 research poll found that 41% of American adults believe that the rapture will happen before the year 2060. 41%. What happens to a society and to a political system when so many are convinced that life as we know it is going to end suddenly with a kind of deus ex machina for those in the know? When so many see no need to plan for the long haul? What happens to the political landscape when so many have been trained to trust any voice, sincere or not, that feeds them messages they've been taught to listen for? This is not a book that mocks belief. Rather, it explores what happens when articles of belief or doctrine are used as instruments of power. Because of my experience, I feel I was able to write from the inside out, able to imagine myself as the prophet, myself as the prophet's skeptical son, and myself as the world-weary actress in California who needs to believe in a hoped-for promise of release. I think that's all I've got. I had a great time writing this novel, and I really think people will enjoy reading it, and I do feel like it's a timely story.
Thank you so much. We have some good comments going about how much people have loved your previous books.
Thank you.
Always exciting to see, and how the themes tie into what's going on the world stage right now. So I'm sure we'll all have an excellent read. Our next author up is Kelli Jo Ford, a citizen of the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma. She is the recipient of numerous literary awards and fellowships, and her fiction has appeared in a collection of literary journals. She lives in Virginia with her husband, who is a poet, her daughter, and a dog named Sylvia Plath. Cricket Hallelujah is a novel and stories about 4 generations of Cherokee women to be published by Grove Atlantic in just a few days. The book has received a lot of advance praise, including 2-starred reviews. Publishers Weekly calls it a stunner, and Booklist calls it electrifying. We'd love to hear more about your book, Kelli Jo Ford.
Thank you so much. It sounds weird hearing you say that out loud. Thank you. And I just want to say thanks to all the booksellers. These are not the times we ask for, but really appreciate all the hard work you all are doing through all of this. And Crooked Hallelujah, here is the book. It follows a Cherokee mother and daughter who moved from eastern Oklahoma's Indian country to North Texas, trying to start a new life. It turns out that's during the 1980s oil bust. So it doesn't exactly go as planned. At its heart, it's a story about mothers and daughters, a story about, as I think I mentioned, 4 generations of Cherokee women. And interestingly, following you, Lin, a harsh fundamentalist Christian upbringing follows the family, and faith saves these families even as it breaks them. And, you know, and it also serves as a really isolating influence on them between like what would be their Cherokee communities and the white communities around them. It's a real cloistered existence that they live back home. And you know, the book comes from me following my obsessions. I think that I was trying to tell a story of place as much as people, and really a story of 2 places, because this the youngest generations are going back and forth, are unsettled. They're really unable to put down roots in either place. And I think in a lot of ways, I did bring props. I was writing my way toward home, a home that in some ways was lost to me, like Renee, the youngest character or the youngest protagonist in the book. The facts of my story are similar to Renee's in that I was also raised in a family with 4 generations of Cherokee women. There's my grandmother, great grandmother, and my mom and I, and we all lived in the same house when I was a little girl, and sometimes with other people coming in and out as well. But so having a household like this growing up, and these women of incredible strength and love and protecting one another because we had to and we were who we had. I've really carried that with me my whole life, even though, I left home when I was 18 and have never gone back to live there. It is very much how I identify myself. I think that, when I tell my story, I tell the story of coming from a family of strong women. And so even though this is a book of fiction, that's just what came out of me. And that is the book that I wrote, I guess. So I meant to start a timer. How am I doing here?
Oh, you're good. You have 2 minutes left.
I have 2 minutes. I know we're not going to do a reading, but I wanted to read a quick passage if I had time. This is from the middle of the book. And this is when Renee, the youngest character, is a teenager. And this is one of the times they've gone back to Oklahoma. They're going back home. We ran by the truck stop for a 6-pack of baby beers and a Dr. Pepper. And then we were flying through town with the T-tops off and the windows down. I pushed "I do not want what I haven't got" into the tape deck. But before Sinead could finish the Serenity Prayer, Mom popped it out and put in 1999. We'd done a version of this the whole 5-hour drive from Texas. I'd put in some of my music and feel for a minute like I wasn't in a car sagging with the weight of half our lives. Headed to Lula's where there was no TV and the only records were Mahalia Jackson and Gospel Elvis. Mom gave everything a chance, but the Prince tape she had bought at our first fill-up always went back in. She'd go right to Little Red Corvette and sing like the car was her shower and I wasn't sitting there so sick of Prince I could puke. Her whole life she'd wanted a Corvette, but she was married to Pitch, or used to be, who could say? She'd taken over payments on the Mustang before we left. The thing sounded like it'd been run into the ground, but I think it had her thinking about possibilities again. The future, maybe. Please, can I drive when we get to the highway, I asked. I had my hips hovering over the seat, trying to zip the cutoffs I didn't dare wear at Lula's. Mom whipped her head around and downshifted. Before I knew what was happening, we were mid-U-turn, pulling into the filler-up parking lot. Renee, she killed the car and took a big breath. Don't look, but there's your daddy. We bugged our eyes at each other, and then we started laughing. So that's a little introduction to the book and where it sprung from. Thank you so much, everyone.
You're welcome. People are mentioning all the pieces, the acclaim that's been coming in for the book already. Indie's introduced, Indie's next. So thank you. You got to see it here for the first time. And some people are reading it. So I guess Grove is doing their part to get the galleys out.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone.
Our next author is Reid Forgrave. He writes about sports and other topics for a collection of well-known media outlets, including GQ, the New York Times Magazine, and Mother Jones. And he's covered the NFL and college football for Fox and CBS. He currently writes for the Star Tribune and lives in Minneapolis with his wife and 2 sons. Love, Zach is his first book. Kirkus calls it an intelligent and provocative tale. It's a tragic story that shows us how football mirrors America, and we'll let him tell you all about it.
First of all, thank you guys so much for having me, and thank you for everything you guys are doing in this completely wild time that we live in. I want to tell you first about this young man named Zach Easter, who's the main character of my book, Love, Zach. And the first time I heard the name Zach Easter, it was in his obituary. It was a day or two before Christmas of 2015. I was back in Pittsburgh visiting my family for the holidays, and I got an email from an old friend. He'd seen Zach's obituary in the Des Moines Register, a newspaper that I used to work for. And he said, hey, you should check this out. Look, an obituary for a 24-year-old man, it's always heartbreaking. It's just the nature of it. But Zach's obituary was even more so. It was juxtaposed with this photograph with his enormous smile and these details that indicated a bright future really should have been ahead of him. He recently graduated with a 4.0 GPA, that he was a decorated soldier in the Iowa National Guard, He loved the Green Bay Packers, and he was just so incredibly proud of this 10-point buck that he'd nabbed his senior year of high school. But Zach, he couldn't see all of that. He just saw a future where the brain disease that he had, that he blamed on playing football only through high school, would slowly destroy him. So 6 days before Christmas, Zach committed suicide. It was the 6th and the final paragraph of his obituary that made me realize I had to find out more about the tragic tale of Zach Easter. Here's what it said. Zach was a selfless person. His last wish was to make sure that no one else has to struggle from head trauma like he did. It's important to Zach to tell his story about CTE, a disease he attempted to manage for years. He suffered from severe migraines, brain tremors, slurred speech, blurred vision, and dementia, among other physical ailments. He is unselfishly donating his brain, along with a detailed diary that documented his life, so that no one suffers the way that he did. He bravely fought the silent disease for years until he was no longer able. His spirit will always be with us. Zach asked that memorials be donated to the Concussion Legacy Foundation so that further research can be done on this disease. His final request is that people talk about CTE, support more research, and to value knowledge. And so that's how I found myself on the first Sunday afternoon of 2016, sitting on the floor of Brenda and Miles Easter's living room. Mounted on the wall beside me is Zach's prize 10-point buck, and on the television right behind me was the game between Zach's Green Bay Packers and his father's favorite team, the Minnesota Vikings. It had been less than 2 weeks since their son had taken his father's 20-gauge shotgun and shot himself in the chest. The Easters live in the timber and cornfields outside the small town of Indianola, Iowa. And their family history is fascinating. The family history here in this part of the country dates back to before the Civil War. And their version of what manhood should look like stems from generations of living off this land. And this traditional version of masculinity became quickly apparent when, as I spent hours speaking with Zach's parents and his brothers and his girlfriend about how his decade of playing football recklessly, from 3rd grade through high school, it led to so many concussions and eventually led to his demise. And this whole time, all the men in the room, myself included, kept sneaking glances at the NFL game on television behind us. And let's be honest, kept looking on our cell phones about checking our fantasy football scores. I've spent much of my career examining human suffering. I believe there's great meaning about the human condition that can be derived from the lessons we learn from tragedy. I'm comfortable steering into that pain. But from that first afternoon when I met this Easter family, I could tell there was something different, something special, something vital about Zach's story. The first part was that Zach left behind these reams of journals that documented his decline, and the family gave those journals to me. It was remarkable to be able to watch in real time those mood swings, the confusion, the unpredictable and often self-destructive behavior that came with Zach's CTE. That's chronic traumatic encephalopathy, the brain disease that's become associated with athletes in contact sports, particularly in football. But look, beyond Zach's personal tragedy, what makes his story a vital tale about today's America is what he represents. This is a book that's about sports, but please don't think of it as a sports book. It's a book about what it means to be a man in 21st century America. It's a book about parenting. It's a book about what fathers pass on to their sons. I have 2 young sons myself, and I can't help seeing Zach in both of them, particularly in my younger son, who is quite a reckless young boy. This is a book about that blurry line where our traditional views on masculinity cross over into toxic masculinity. It's a book about America's addiction to violence, not just in our sports, but in our everyday lives. Just about how violence is just part of who we are as human beings. It's a book about, frankly, what we value as a nation. And hopefully, this is a book that honors Zach's wish to bring to the forefront his concerns about the safety of the sport that he and his family still deeply, deeply love. Thank you guys for sharing Zach's story with your customers and your readers. I really appreciate it, and I know Zach's family does as well. I want to end just with the final words of a 39-page document that Zach wrote, that he printed off, and that he left in his childhood bedroom before he committed suicide. Take it with grace and know that I love you all. Spread the word of mental illness and concussions, and over time, please spread my story. Great things can still happen from this event. Think of all the lives that can be saved if all of you come together and help people by spreading the word. Thank you guys so much. Appreciate you guys having me.
Thank you, Reid, for that moving presentation. Some booksellers are agreeing with you that it's much more than football. And Kelli Jo Ford and all of the authors here, click on the galley request link and request your galley. Remember that galley is our implicit marketing request from publishers. If they give it to you, they really want you to make some noise. It's a marketing tool. So get online, tag the author, tag us, and share what you learned in those pages. So moving on next to our where are we? We're on our 6th author, K.A. Holt. K.A. Holt is short for Kari Ann Holt, which I discovered online and needed to share since that's my name too. Holt is an author of 10 YA books, 1 picture book, and is included in a few adult anthologies, and you have to scroll a few times to read all of the awards these books have received. In Ben B. and the Teacher Griefer, a heartfelt, laugh-out-loud, funny middle-grade novel, Ben Bellows and his classmates learn they aren't dumb, they're divergent thinkers. Sure to inspire lovers of Minecraft, I bet you'll find an easy audience for this tale, released in September by Chronicle. So please tell us more about it, K.A. Holt.
Hello. First, I want to let you know that I'm tucked upstairs in my daughter's bedroom to try to get away from everyone, so I might break in and out. My connection's not super great here. This is Ben B. And the Teacher Griefer. This is the first book in a series of 4 books that will each highlight one of the characters that's in this book. This is a middle grade novel that's told in verse, it's told in stream of consciousness, it's told in illustrations, it's told in video game chat, all these different ways. And you're getting the perspectives of 4 kids who have been thrust into a summer school class together, and their school is being renovated. So the class that they're in is really just a space under the stairwell. And they have a teacher who's constantly telling them that they're divergent thinkers. They failed the standardized test, not because they're dumb, but because they think differently than everyone else. And of course, they don't really believe her. They don't really trust her. They don't want to read out loud in class, which is one of the requirements of summer school. And so they make a deal with her that for every 10 minutes they read out loud in class, she will play 10 minutes of a video game with them. And there's this one particular game called Sandbox that all the kids like. And so they're determined to show her how in Sandbox, they really are divergent and like they do all kinds of cool things and there's no such thing as mistakes. And she's determined to get them to see that, they're not dummies in real life. Everything kind of goes crazy when she gets in trouble for letting them play video games in class. And they all kind of have to band together to help their teacher out. I wrote this book because I have 3 kids and 2 of my 3 kids don't love reading. And I made a deal with my youngest son a couple of summers ago that I would play Minecraft with him for every minute that he read a book. And I learned a lot about these things that he was doing. Like he was doing these amazing, like creating all of this architecture, and he was learning about chemistry. And so now for his birthdays, he gets architecture books, and I learned a lot, and he learned that thinking divergently is a good thing. I think I've dedicated my career really to writing books that have characters who are not typical main characters of books. I really, really want readers who hate reading to pick up one of my books and make it to the end and feel happy that they have done it. I get a lot of emails from kids who say that my books are some of the first books that they've read all the way to the end, and I think that's great. And it's because they have these free verse. It's free verse, it doesn't fill the page, right? So if you're a reader who's kind of reluctant, you jump to this and you say, oh, it's a little bit different. If you're a reader who loves to read, you see it and you're like, oh, it's a little bit different, I'm gonna check it out. So I really, really want kids to see how books can be just as divergent as they are. And it's important for me, for kids who don't always feel like books are about them, to read my books and to see kids who have dyslexia as a main character, or dysgraphia as a main character, or who are figuring out their gender as a main character. All of these different things are things that I focus on. And I try really hard to be funny too. I think this is probably one of the funniest books that I've ever written. And I got to do the illustrations as one of the characters, whose name is Javier. And I tried to turn in illustrations just as an example for the designer, and they said, "Wow, your drawing looks just like a 7th grade boy's, so we're gonna keep yours in there," which was really hard and fun. So anyway, I hope that if you have kids who walk into your store, or you have parents who walk into your bookstore and they're like, "I really would like my kid to read, but my kid doesn't like to read," hand them this and see what they think about it, and fingers crossed they'll like it. All right.
Awesome, thank you. That was a perfect way to pitch your book so that booksellers know exactly what's in it. Moving on to our next author, Becky Mandelbaum, who is the author of the award-winning, multi-award-winning, I actually have written down, collection of stories, Bad Kansas, the state she's originally from. She now lives in Bellingham, Washington. Today, she'll be talking about The Brightside Sanctuary for Animals, her debut novel. In a starred review, Publishers Weekly calls it big-hearted and emotionally intelligent, and that Becky's love for animals proves to be irresistible. The book will be featured on the August Indie Next list, and Mandelbaum will be returning home to the Raven Bookstore in Lawrence, Kansas, whether physically or virtually, to launch her book on August 5th. So please tell us more about your book, Becky.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for being here. I feel like totally in awe of the company I'm in, so I'm so excited to start reading everyone's books. Kelli Jo's book is amazing. So my book is The Brightside Sanctuary for Animals, and I have my assistant here in the back. Her name is Freya. She is also a talented writer. So The Brightside Sanctuary for Animals is a mother-daughter story, and it is about Mona, who owns the Brightside Sanctuary for Animals, and her daughter Ariel, who ends up running away from the sanctuary when she's 18, just because it's so chaotic, and she starts to have a rift with her mom. So the book follows Ariel in 2016 when she learns that the Brightside has been the target of a hate crime, and also her mom is selling the sanctuary. So the story follows Ariel as she returns home to try to make good with her mom, who she hasn't talked to in years at that point. But when she returns home, she discovers her mom is not as interested in forgiveness as Ariel hoped. So it's sort of a struggle of Ariel trying to make good with her mom. Another thing that happens is Ariel, who's engaged to this really silly, kind of goofy guy back in Lawrence, where she's gone to college, she discovers her first love is still working as a ranch hand at her mom's sanctuary. So the book is a lot about Ariel trying to reconcile her past with her present. So in her past, she has the animal sanctuary and this very serious, difficult life trying to take care of animals and support her mother's passion. And then she has her present life in Lawrence, where she's, popular, and she has her fiance Dex. But yeah, so it's about her coming to terms with what kind of life she wants, while also trying to practice some of the unconditional love that the animals tried to teach her. And I started this book when I was a senior at the University of Kansas, and I did some volunteering at an animal sanctuary where the owner, I was just so fascinated with her because she cared so deeply about what she was doing, but she was just so in over her head. She had so many animals and only one helper, and not enough money. And it was just, I just so admired her and wondered what it would be like if she had a daughter who had to grow up in that environment, and whether the daughter would be game to help or whether she would want to sort of go her own way. So that's where the book started. And I also just love animals and I'm obsessed with them and really wanted to write about them. Freya agrees. Yeah, so I think that this book would be really great for people who like mother-daughter stories. That is the central narrative, although there are some romantic love stories in there too. Also people who love animals. And there are also a lot of themes of forgiveness and working towards reconciliation with people who have betrayed us or whose ideas we no longer believe in. There are some political narratives in the book, and I think, especially right now, my hope is that the book sends a message of that we're first and foremost people sharing space and trying to take care of one another and working together. And I think animals are a really good reminder of the fact that we are also animals on the earth, and that at our very most fundamental level, we're just creatures trying to survive and take care of one another. And sometimes we make mistakes, sometimes we fail, but there's always room for forgiveness if we try. So I hope that's sort of what the book is doing. It's also a book for people who like strong and sometimes feisty, flawed female characters. There's also some flawed animals in the book who also deserve some room for forgiveness. Yeah, it's out on August 4th from Simon & Schuster. And yeah, I hope you like it.
Well, it sounds like there's quite a few people who have already gotten their hands on it, so that's great. It's an Indie Next pick as well. Pam asks if there's a galley. Do you mean the galley request link? I hope that's already in the chat field. From a person who has 2 dogs and 3 cats, I absolutely appreciate your love of animals and look forward to reading the book. What was the dog's name again behind you?
Freya.
Freya. So thank you, Freya.
She says you're welcome.
And Danny Keene, owner of the Raven Bookstore, posted the link. I see that the event will be virtual, and I'm sure he would be happy to have any of you attend.
Thank you, Danny.
So we will move on to Alice Randall, the author of 4 previous novels. She's a Harvard-educated food reform activist and lives in Nashville, where she writes country songs. Under the HarperCollins Amistad imprint, next month, Black Bottom Saints will be hitting your shelves. Compared to Merlin James' A Brief History of 7 Killings, which reimagined real-life events in mid-70s Jamaica, Black Bottom Saints fictionally recreates Detroit in its heyday. It's a lively blend of history and fiction, capped by 52 chapter closers, special drink recipes capturing the spirit of the time. Please tell us more about your imaginative creation, Alice Randall.
First, thank you so much. I was born in Detroit, and this book was very much born in Detroit. And it has many, many characters from other places in the heartland. And I'll just jump right in and say, it's a truly joyful book about really, really hard themes. And in fact, I had a pop-up book club meeting 2 Sundays ago with the head of Black Lives Matter at Harvard and some Black Lives Matter kids from Columbia. And they said when they got to the Tanya Blanding chapter, they were looking forward to their drink, but there was only lemonade there. And they started to cry because they had to be stopped and held in this sober, non-intoxicating moment. The nadir of the book is Tanya Blanding. She is the saint that begins fall. She is a little girl who was killed in the Detroit rebellion in the summer of '67. She weighed 40 pounds, and she was killed in her own home, hiding underneath her dining room table. She was killed a couple of blocks away from my cousin, where I often played. We don't really call Tanya Blanding's name. So what I will say, this book I've been working on for a decade. I researched it for 7 hard, intensive years. Wrote it for 3 years, including a sabbatical year. So this is, when I say it speaks back to Black Lives Matter, this is not a new idea. Tanya Blanding has always, I've been thinking about her since the day she did die. And it also speaks across to Me Too. So I'm gonna jump in and tell you, this is my first event for this virtual tour. Something I've never actually said publicly, but my first book was A Wind Done Gone. It was a New York Times bestseller. It was weirdly, with the lawsuit, it was out in the world in a very strange way. It's continued to live on. But in the process of that and through other novels, I often get the question, who inspired you to want to be a writer? When did you want to be a writer? Who's your favorite writer? And I often say Zora Neale Hurston. I often say Jean Rhys, because I'm always interested in telling the other side of the story, and Wind Done Gone was that. But about 10 years ago, I realized that wasn't completely true, although I can think of myself as a profoundly candid, tell the truth person. Because I knew I really had actually wanted to be a writer since I was 3 years old. And I also knew this other thing. When I was involved in therapy and a variety of things, people would ask me the question, because I sometimes seem very happy, and I am very happy, how did you survive such an abusive childhood? And in fact, it was so abusive, my mother put me in the hospital, talk about it in front of other people, because I thought it wasn't relevant, and I thought I'd just been lucky. And I thought about those two things. You think, and I realized the answer to who was my favorite, why did I want to be a writer since I was 3 years old, and how did I survive my crazy childhood, was the same person, Ziggy Johnson, who's on the cover of this book. A man who owned an inner city dancing school. He was an MC for the hottest clubs in town and wrote a gossip column for the New York Times. And my father only went to one semester of college and didn't have a pair of shoes before he was 13 years old. He did not read me from children's books, though I've written some award-winning children's books. He read to me from the Michigan Chronicle. Ziggy's language was the first language I had fallen in love with and had heard. And Ziggy's stories in this little dancing school that I started attending when I was 3 years old, that included stories of people such as Ethel Waters, one of my saints, whose mother had been raped and twice wrote her autobiography. People don't realize that Ethel Waters didn't write her story once, she wrote it twice. Della Reese, who he told us about, who was a victim of domestic violence. Her drink is called The Last Lick. It looks like a bruise on brown skin. It has a wine skim on the top of it. But Della, who wanted to go to Harvard Medical School and be a psychiatrist until her mother died, and also was targeted towards Spelman, ended up having to go into the entertainment business to support herself. She was behind the scenes an early anti-domestic violence activist. You haven't seen that portrait of her before. Ziggy, the story of my novel, is Ziggy Johnson in the last 4 months of his life, which is true. He was in Kerwood Hospital, writes a Saints Day book in which he writes the lives of his 53, it turns out to be 60, favorite people that he's sending for one person, Colored Girl, the character I may or may not be based on. Wildly, it's so many people's stories. People have said in Publishers Weekly, they say it's Althea Gibson. I have all kinds of people who said, you wrote me, that they saw Colored Girl. Who knows, Colored Girl is the one girl who has to try to move from trauma to transcendence. She does have, it is about we shall rise from the ashes. It has everything. I wrote it back to Me Too because I think one of the secrets of Black life, and I have been an anti-rape activist longer than I've been an anti-racism activist, is that we know, my daughter just wrote that big story on Confederate body monuments in the New York Times. We know from Black culture that we can survive rape because we've been raped as long as we've been in America. Since the experience of being on plantations was an experience of being raped, and multi-generations of it. It does not minimize the crime, it does not minimize the challenge, but we have built transcendent lives around that experience. And one of the things I say in this book is Tycoon. We're gonna share that with a broken world, even a world that's against us, that there was stuff that Ziggy gave me that led me to leave a life that was spotted to hard-won happy, never denying what had happened, but being able to move from this trauma to transcendence. And there are 53 different ways. There are 53 cocktails in this book. It speaks, as I said, deeply to Black Lives Matter. We've got Tanya Blanding in here, but it's all Black Lives Matter. It's one of the stories I love best in here is Scatterbrain Stevens, also from the Midwest. He was a heroin dealer on which Superfly was built. He was a good friend of Ziggy's. How did I research it? Ziggy left 1,000 columns. It took me 2 or 3 years to get them all because they've never been digitized. I had to find microfilm. There are only, I think, 11 copies allegedly in the world. I found 7 of them. And it spent 2 summers in a basement of a library just printing those up, finding them. No one knew what years they were. No one's done any scholarship on Ziggy. I found his 1,000 columns over 20 years. I researched those people then, tracking them down. Often he wrote in code. When he said someone went to college, it didn't mean they went to college, it meant they were in jail.
Alice, you got about 30 seconds?
This is all I know about trauma and transcendence. Black Detroit, which was cooler than Harlem, cooler than Bronzeville, and the story hasn't been told. It's something everybody in the Midwest can be proud of. The motto of Detroit is, we will rise from the ashes. And right now, we will all rise from the ashes. Very Hamilton-like, it's all Black, inviting everybody to just experience the humanity of each of these characters. There's somebody for everybody.
Wow. Boy, I just, got the shivers just thinking about your book. Thank you. If you haven't, maybe you'll share that link. You said your daughter wrote something about Confederate monuments. Maybe you'll share that link if you have it.
Allison from Source Booksellers in Detroit, they have an upcoming virtual event and all are welcome. She put that in the chat.
We are so excited about that.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think Caroline needs one more reader, but I'll throw that in. I think she's, I bet there's no one on this call.
All right. Well, our next author, Rudy Ruiz, was born in Brownsville, Texas, and raised along the US-Mexico border, living in Mexico for extensive periods of time. He did not speak English until he entered school at the age of 5. He now resides in San Antonio with his wife and their 2 children. The author of 3 previous books, his new novel, The Resurrection of Fulgencio Ramirez, will be released in September by Blackstone Publishing. A work of magical realism, the novel weaves together the past and present as it explores how life on the border impacts the people who live there. Please jump in, Rudy Ruiz.
Thank you. I'm so worked up about Alice Randall's book at Park of 60. But some interesting commonalities, for what I think Alice mentioned, Brownsville, probably we're talking about Brownsville, New York. I'm from Brownsville, Texas. So when I went off to college and was up in the Northeast, people often thought I was from Brownsville, New York. It was interesting. Another interesting aspect and commonality there is that The Resurrection of Fulgencio Ramirez is a novel I started writing 20 years ago. It's a magical realism novel. I was very inspired by the works of Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Isabel Allende, and other Latin American writers that I studied in college. And I often found that I wanted to see that lens, that literary style and lens applied to authentic stories of Mexican Americans in the U.S. I felt a lot of kinship culturally with the stories that those authors told, but those authors were set, far away in Macondo in Colombia or, in Chile. Other countries. So I wanted to bring that sensibility to a border story because I grew up on the US-Mexico border. I was born and raised in Brownsville, Texas, as I said. And I was largely inspired by the childhood stories that my father shared with me of his upbringing on the border in the 50s. Son of poor Mexican immigrants, like orphaned by the Mexican Revolution, but born in Texas and trying to kind of reach for that idyllic fable that is the American dream. But I wanted to do it in a novel rather than in a biography. And the story is really one about how these cultural divisions that we have in our society, as we're seeing today, how they have created these seemingly insurmountable obstacles for people to achieve their goals, whether those are, dreams of success or dreams of being with a particular person and being accepted and tolerated by their family and by society. you know, there's so many obstacles and divisions that are created both externally and internally, in, whether how they see themselves, how they limit themselves. You know, so these were some of the themes that I explore in the resurrection of Fulgencio Ramirez as he grows up in the 50s on the border, falls in love with an American woman who really symbolizes the American dream for him, loses her love through a variety of reasons, and then finds himself as an adult in the 1980s trying to win her back when he learns that her husband has died. And so he's given a second chance in a way. One of the interesting aspects of Fulgencio is he's a singer of traditional Mexican songs. It's the music of the 1950s that was very popular in Mexico. And so I created a playlist that I shared at the beginning of the chat on Spotify. And these were all songs that in Spanish that I grew up listening to my dad sing, because my dad had this amazing, beautiful, angelic, powerful, passionate voice that just viscerally affected me. You know, I would get goosebumps, and a smile would just be stamped on my face when I would hear him sing. And it was interesting because, you know, here was this very tough, you know, ambitious, but very flawed person, which is who I tried to create in Fulgencio. And yet when he sang, you just saw this portal into his soul that showed a lot of tenderness and a lot of love and a lot of suffering and a lot of unrequited emotion, you know.
1 minute left, Rudy?
I'm sorry?
1 minute left.
Okay, yeah. So, you know, the songs are a part of the book, and I think that's why they form part of the journey in the book, which is a trip to the border in a way, but it's also a trip to the culture of northern Mexico and South Texas, which is really kind of one, you know, one culture in a way. This used to be one land, and then the border, the Rio Grande became the border, and that border became a division. And so ultimately it explores how can borders between us that have been artificially created be overcome, and how can they become places not of suffering and conflict, but of unity and healing. And that's my hope for Fulgencio, and here's the book. And I hope you guys have a chance to check it out. And thank you once again for your time, and it's been an honor to be amongst you all.
Sure, it was a gorgeous cover. Thank you. Before I forget, someone asked about Becky Mandelbaum's galley, and I checked my email. We never got the link from SNS, Simon & Schuster. So you can get an e-galley on Edelweiss. You could email your Simon & Schuster rep, or here, I'll put my email address here, email me, and we'll make sure that you get a galley. It was probably just an administrative oversight. So moving on to the last in our group of authors, J. Scott Savage is the author of 18 acclaimed novels and has presented at more than 1,500 schools across the country, inspiring students to embrace their own creativity and change the world. Scott lives in Utah with his wife and 4 children. His newest book, The Lost Wonderland Diaries, published by Shadow Mountain, will debut in September. It reimagines what might happen if the world were to rediscover a set of Lewis Carroll's lost journals. So please tell us more, Scott.
Hey, thank you so much. So first of all, I just want to say thanks to all the other authors who presented here today. I'm just so excited about all these books. I think when we get done, we need to flip it around and like have all the booksellers tell us about all their books while we just sit here and take notes. So thanks for having me here. I am the author of the 4-World Middle Grade Fantasy series, the Case File 13 Middle Grade Horror series, and the Mysteries of Cove Steampunk Dragon series. So my newest book is the Lost Wonderland Diaries, try to get that set there, which does come out September 8th. And basically the idea came to me because I've always loved Alice in Wonderland. I've loved the kind of combination of imagination and logic and how that all works together. And one time I was reading about Lewis Carroll and discovered that he kept diaries his whole life. But after he died, 4 of those diaries disappeared and no one knows what happened to them. So in this story, Celia and Tyrus discover the missing diaries. They open them, accidentally get sucked into Wonderland, and discover that it is a real but very dangerous place, and that something is turning all the creatures into monsters. And so they have to figure out how to save Wonderland. One of the first things that I realized when I started to write this book was that I had to essentially write it to three groups of writers. On the one hand, you've got especially a lot of kids who may never have heard of Alice in Wonderland or read the books, and maybe they haven't seen the movies. And so for them, I wanted to write just a straight middle grade story. A lot of my books are said to appeal to reluctant readers. So I wanted something that could just grab you right away and pull you in. And Celia, who has dyslexia, is a reluctant reader, and her mother's a librarian. She really hates books. Tyrus is the ultimate book nerd, and they kind of meet each other and go through. So that was the first group. The second group that I had to appeal to was the people, and this is probably my biggest group, people who know Alice in Wonderland primarily from the movies or maybe the Disneyland rides or whatever. They probably haven't read the book in quite a while. And so for them, they're going to see a lot of the characters that they're familiar with. So you've got the Mad Hatter, you've got the Cheshire Cat, you've got the White Rabbit, but they've changed. The Mad Hatter's been stuck in a tea party for 150 years. The Cheshire Cat has had his disappearing body replaced by a mechanical body. The White Rabbit has turned a little bit psychotic. He got attacked by this monstrosity. And so people will recognize those, but they'll also find new characters. And then the third group is my group. It's the Lewis Carroll aficionados, the people who know all about him and love all his stories. And for them, I wanted to have lots of really fun Easter eggs and things where they'd be like, oh, look, they explored this, and that's why they talked about this. So that's kind of why I started telling it. The second question I probably get asked the most is why write a retelling? There are so many great retellings of Alice in Wonderland. I didn't want this to be like a retelling or a spin-off per se. I didn't want it to be steampunk Alice, or Alice has grown up and she's in an asylum, or you know, Alice on drugs. I wanted this to be two kids finding the Wonderland that we know and exploring it and introducing all of the puzzles and logic and the tests and kind of taking them through. And one of the things that I loved about the original Alice in Wonderland is that Lewis Carroll was really breaking ground when he had a young girl be the narrator of his book. That just wasn't done at the time. And so I wanted my two characters, my two narrators, to also kind of break a little ground. And so Celia, over here, she is a dyslexic girl, and dyslexia is a huge part of her life, and it's affected her self-esteem and how she looks at herself. And Tyrus is a huge book nerd. He carries a book backpack around all the time, just filled with books, and he kind of escapes into books. And so when we go into Wonderland, we get to see from a kid's point of view, and we get to explore more. We get to go see a lot of areas. We get to meet characters we didn't meet before, like what happens to the people who get their heads cut off when the queen says off with their heads. Well, they've got this great headless ball going on where they trade heads, and just a whole bunch of new creatures that we haven't met. And then probably the last question that I get asked the most is, by booksellers, how do I introduce this book? Who do I position this book to? So I think, first of all, if you have anyone who loves Alice in Wonderland, this hopefully will be a book that they'll really want to read and get into and get a lot from. It's also a very weird book, and that's Lewis Carroll. Like, one of my biggest compliments is when reviewers go, I actually had to look and see if this part was from this book or if it was really from Alice in Wonderland, because I love that writing style. And so there's a lot of really strange things. There's monsters, there's puzzles, just a lot of things to pull kids in. And then finally, I hope this will appeal to kids who love reading and just want to devour the next book, and kids who really kind of hate reading and that's really not their thing. I'd like to appeal to that whole group. So that is a little bit about the book. As was mentioned, I do a lot of tours. We've kind of moved things a little bit. We'll probably have an unlaunch party at some point when things clear up, but we are doing lots of virtual events. So if you would like an e-arc, you can get that. If you'd like a physical arc, or if you'd like to schedule a virtual appearance, which I will be doing in the fall, Shadow Mountain has their virtual exhibit here on the website, and you can go in and make an appointment to talk with Elise Levine, who is the sales director at Shadow Mountain. So anyhow, that's it again. There's a couple fun things you can show people. We've got all kinds of cool formatting. Like if you remember if you remember the mouse's tail from the original book, we've got our kind of own version of the mouse's tail. I sort of like the Easter egg trailers in movies that are kind of at the end after the credits. So if you go all the way past, there's the author's note and about the author, and there's discussion questions. Well, if you go to the very back and you want to tell a secret to your readers, if you go past the blank pages, then you get this little page. If you can see that, it says turn here, and you have to follow the little cat footprints along the pages. But eventually you get to our little Easter egg scene in the very back. So anyhow, if you want to show a secret to the readers, then you can tell them there's an after credits Easter egg. So again, thank you so much. Yep, there's a link there to the exhibit. And if you have any other questions, feel free to shoot them in there and I would be happy to answer those. So again, thanks so much for having us. And this was a lot of fun. And thanks to all the other authors.
For sure. Thank you, everybody. The only thing that would make this better is if we had a reception where we all hang out and eat cocktail foods and had some drinks together. If there's anything else that anybody wants to jump in and share, we went a little bit over. People are probably wanting to move around a little bit, but learning a lot about a lot of great books to carry this summer and this fall. I wanted to say you can save the chat by clicking on the 3 dots, and then the Save Chat button comes up if there's anything you wanted. All of the galley links are on our Heartland website, so you can get them there. And follow each other, have conversations, reach out, and talk about the galleys and make lots of noise. And I guess we'll end it there. Right, Larry and Kate?
Yeah, sounds good. Also, this event was recorded, so we will have this available on the Heartland Fall Forum website.
Okay, thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.